Akhil, Satish, Siddharth, Deepak, Ashwini, thank you all for talking to us about automation and cloud security. Well, it's noon now, and we are inching closer to the big event of the day. That's the 8th annual CISO Awards, where we will be celebrating visionary CISOs who are really avant-garde, building defenses to protect our digital lives. Now that's at 5 p.m., and you will find out who amongst your peers are winning, and we'll get there soon. But for now, we have an international keynote lined up. Tony Anscombe, the Chief Security Evangelist at ESET, is connecting in and talking to us about legislation and regulation. Are they a friend or foe of cyber defenders? Let's listen in.
So thank you, Ashwin. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it. And I'd just like to say before I start my presentation that I'm honored and feel privileged to actually be presenting at this summit today. So please accept my thanks for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk about, is legislation and regulation the friend or foe of cyber defenders? This kind of goes on the theme of the summit of empowering cyber defenders, because I think sometimes in the industry we think about empowerment being technology and only technology, and it's not. And there's also legislation and many other things that fit into a cybersecurity framework. And I'm going to give you some history on some of these and look to see where some of this might go as we move forward in time. So firstly, this is me. So I'm the Chief Security Evangelist at ESET. And the importance of this slide is if you have any questions, you want to connect with me afterwards, here's my email address, here's my Twitter address, and my LinkedIn page. So feel free to connect with me afterwards. But moving swiftly on to get into the content of what we're going to talk about. Well, the first thing is to understand that cybercrime is a business. And I think as cybersecurity professionals, we don't always appreciate and fully adopt the attitude that cybercrime runs and feels like a business, maybe from the cyber criminal's perspective. And this was brought home to me a number of years ago when I sat in a research lab just after a holiday period, so after a Christmas period, and it appeared that certain instances of malware declined over holiday periods. Now, that's not true of all malware, of course, but these certain campaigns were declining. And it was nearly like the malware writers' companies closed down for the holidays in the same way other companies do. And this kind of maybe brought it home that these are people that come to an office, they sit at desks and they run campaigns and they run a business and they have prospects, et cetera, et cetera. So think of this as a business. Now, back in 2018, how much was this actual business worth? I mean, globally. And a guy called Dr. Michael McGuire gave a presentation at RSA in San Francisco, and he added up all the different elements around the world. So we often hear our own governments, the Indian government, or where I am in the US, or where I'm from, the UK governments, they'll all talk about how much it costs business in their regions, but nobody really talks about the global issue, or didn't, certainly back then, I think. And he estimated this to be $1.5 trillion, which is an awful lot of money. In 2018, that was a massive amount of money. Now, he also delved into, what a cyber criminal might make in revenue and stuff like that. So very super interesting if you want to look back on that. It was updated in 2020 by the World Economic Forum in their Global Risk Report. They estimated this to be $6 trillion. That was in 2020. And Cybersecurity Ventures have estimated this to be 10.5 trillion by 2025. Now, to put this in some sort of perspective, if cybercrime were a country, this would be the third largest economy in the world. So that should give you some perspective of just what this is actually costing business, which will be pretty, that's a huge opportunity. And unfortunately, the opportunity is way too big, and which is why cybercrime isn't going away anytime soon. So how do they make this money? Well, let's view this from a consumer's perspective first. Well, they steal our credit card data, they sell our personal data, they steal and sell our personal data. You get things like sextortion. You get ransomware on an individual. However, I think that is somewhat in decline, and maybe we'll come back to that in just a moment. They steal money from our bank accounts by stealing our credentials. That may be a mix of credit card and bank account fraud. So it could be full identity theft. There may be cryptojacking, coin mining through malware, using the resources off our machines, and all sorts of different things. Botnets and controlling of botnets, so using our devices to send spam and other phishing emails to attack others. And where does this overlay with business? Well, stealing from bank accounts, of course, could be the same. I mean, we often hear that business email compromise is one of the biggest threats that a lot of businesses are under, and unfortunately, is a very well social engineered attack against the business. But then you've got denial of service attacks, ransomware. So you've got lots of other issues within business as well. So there's unfortunately, lots of places where cyber criminals can actually make money. So what about empowering the cyber defender so that actually the cyber criminal doesn't make money in the same way? And if we think about that, we've seen certainly over the last 2 years a certain change in cybersecurity, cyber defenders. They've got a seat at the board now. The businesses are listening to them, because actually when the pandemic hit 2 years ago, what we saw was an accelerated digital transformation. What should have taken 5 years happened in 3, 6, 9 months. Companies quickly shifted to cloud applications and secure authentication and VPNs and such like. And companies that maybe weren't fully online transactionally soon stepped up and became transactionally online. So COVID has definitely been an empowerment of cybersecurity professionals. Now, you might sit there and think, I'm not sure of that one. Well, have a think on it. I think you'll realize that actually this has allowed businesses to view the cybersecurity team as a different team. They're a business enabler, as opposed to somebody that's restricting the business, as was maybe the case pre-pandemic. So this is an important step. But what about privacy legislation? Now, we've seen lots of privacy legislation around the world, and we come to some of the global highlights of that in just a moment. But did this empower the cyber defender? Well, if we look back, and think way back, what drove privacy legislation? And is it similar to where we are with cyber incidents today? So if we go back, in fact, let's step back, the 25, 30 years from when I entered the IT industry. I worked as a PC programmer, one of the first PC programmers that, in fact, we were the first people programming on PCs in the bank I worked for in London. And we would program things quicker than the mainframe environment could do. So we would bring the bank the opportunity to enter a new market quickly. Now, what this meant was data suddenly moved off this very, very compliant, big environment that was the IBM host environment. So off of that environment, and suddenly data was sitting on hard disks on desktops nearly. And I say that because some of what we were doing was networking. So they were, servers were actually in a server room, which was quite unique back then. But my point is the data became more portable, and that portability caused the issue of maybe theft. So you then got removable hard, if we shift on time a little bit, you got removable hard drives or hard drives that could be picked up. Then we enter, USB drives and thumb drives and all such like. An email came in, and you could then send these big files across email. Back when I started, this was CompuServe, and it would take you 3 days to send something that was very small. So, data theft was a small issue. But then companies also started to see that you could take advantage. You could manipulate the data quicker. So they started rewards programs and telemarketing. So you go into a supermarket and they log everything you're buying every week, and suddenly they can target you. And same with all retailers and companies. And then corporates realized that actually sharing that data with other people could also, one, bring them additional benefit, bring them additional revenue, but was also good maybe for other companies. And it kind of went in a direction where maybe the consumer lost control or lost vision of what was actually happening with their personal data. And this was all very, very quick. So this global market built, and you had this, let's call it the Wild West of personal and sensitive data in the market, but not being controlled. So these were the drivers behind privacy legislation. Something had to be done to put a check mark on companies, how they collected data, what consent they needed, etc., and how they stored it, and whether the consumer, whether they were doing the right things on behalf of the consumer with it. So what we then see is privacy legislation enter. And if we go back, GDPR is not that long ago. And if we think about GDPR in Europe, that was opt-in, and it has certain cybersecurity requirements for encryption and authentication. More significantly, it has some very big fines. So if companies aren't collecting data in the right for the right reasons, and more to the point, and this is the piece about cybersecurity, they're not storing it in the right way, they're not encrypting it, and they're not protecting it in the right way, the company can also get fined. So this is an enabler. It empowers cybersecurity professionals, whereas companies may not have actually gone down this path of securing data in the right way had you not had privacy legislation of this type. And we've seen some companies get fined for abuse of personal data, so of consumer data. And some of those fines have been very, very significant in Europe. And then I live in California, and in January 2020, the California Consumer Privacy Act took California in the same direction. Now, what was interesting about this was opt-out, whereas GDPR was opt-in. And the right to be, the fine on a company was the right to sue. So as an individual, I could create a class action lawsuit against a company on behalf of, through a lawyer, obviously, we're on behalf of all the people affected by, for example, a data breach. So this put their hands back in very much on the action of lawyers and the consumer and the courts. What it lacked was a regulator. And if I liken that to, I think, where India probably is now, you have the Information Technology Act that certainly has a number of things of reasonable security practices and procedures on sensitive and personal data and information. You have privacy rules in there, which have been in place for maybe around 10 years, as far as I know. But you've got the PDP bill coming soon, and maybe I'd liken kind of where you are, the Information Technology Act, maybe to some way where the CCPA in California was to start with. So California then enacted CPRA, which comes into force in 2023. The big significant difference here, there are some subtle changes in who it affects and stuff like that, but the big difference here is a regulator, which is actually what GDPR put in place very much so in the European Union, a independent regulator that sits there, looks at these incidents, and has the ability to force action and fine companies. And that's what's coming in California. And if I've understood PDP correctly, then I think the proposal is that has some regulation on it too. And in fact, having read some of the proposed language around PDP, it kind of steps beyond GDPR, but you'd expect that too. So for example, CCPA in California kind of stepped beyond GDPR with its definition of what personal data was. It included household data and IP address and such like. Whereas, these acts will leapfrog each other, and then whoever passed their regulation first will then leapfrog the others again. So this all moves on, and the lack of a regulator is significant. It only took California 2 years to realize that actually a regulator was going to change privacy legislation, and it needed that regulation. So that's an important element of it. And if we look at the key principles about privacy legislation, fair and lawful, I mean, I could have gone down the path here of, what does consent look like and all those sorts of things. But in the interest of this keynote, if we look at the key elements of this, it's got to be accurate and up to date, specific and adequate for purpose. Yeah. But the two important things here on this list for me are the reasonable security. Now, reasonable can mean different things to different people, but it is becoming more defined. So if you look at privacy legislation around the world, a lot of it says that you need to have reasonable cybersecurity practice. Now, some legislation does actually specify very specifically types of encryption or multi-factor authentication or other security measures. But a lot of them also use this word reasonable. What it really means is following a cybersecurity framework, such as NIST or whichever one that you decide to follow, and actually implementing that cybersecurity framework and keeping it up to date. Yeah, so not a one and done approach, so actually having this on a continual cycle, and penalties for abuse and infringement. Now, why is that the important piece for cybersecurity? Well, that's the bit that focuses the boardroom, because it's that piece that means the boardroom now are aware that they're going to have to spend money on cybersecurity, securing data and such like. So very, very important. And it forces businesses to secure data. So it forces them to spend money, have processes, get the right people in place, etc. So this is good for cybersecurity people overall. Now, if we think about GDPR, yeah, it cost companies around $7.8 billion, the Fortune 500 companies, to implement GDPR. And remember, while this is a European issue, actually most companies have to become GDPR compliant if you're doing business with anybody in Europe. So this affected people all over the world. So it empowers the cybersecurity defenders by budget and focus in the boardroom, and the business is looking at this. So if we move on, could more legislation, but could we benefit from more legislation? If we look at some cybersecurity incidents and we look through some history very quickly, if we look at where did the monetization of malware start? So switching gears from privacy and personal data here into today's topics, the monetization through malware. And if we look back, this is the AIDS Trojan from 1989. This was the first piece of ransomware. It scrambled some of the directory structures on disks, and basically you could send a check to a PO box in Panama for $189. Now, the likelihood of you ever actually getting anything that fixed your problem is not going to happen. But then this progressed. It became lock screens on devices. It moved to Android and Mac OS, and it then encrypts data. And it's kind of where we know today what ransomware becomes. So this is firstly not new. The idea of using malware to make money, my point here, is not new. This is way back in 1989. But how did it get so big? Now, I'm going to put a stake in the ground here. 2018. This is Atlanta. They suffered, unfortunately, a cyber incident, a ransomware attack. $51,000 was the ransom, and they didn't pay. Now, why I think this particular incident is very, very interesting to look at is they then published about 18 months later what it cost them to recover. Experts said it was going to cost them around $2.5 million at the time. It actually cost them a combined amount of $17 million. Should they have paid $51,000, or should they have said, no, we're not funding cybercrime in this way, we're not going to actually succumb to this, and then they spent $17 million. If you're a taxpayer in Atlanta, you may have said you should have paid the ransom. And there's other examples. The NHS in the UK, through WannaCry, it cost them $121 million to cover. Norsk Hydro, $59 million in 2019. So there are many examples publicly. And if we look at what happened after this, in 2019, you saw a couple of municipalities in Florida pay $500,000 and $600,000. You saw the University of California pay $1.14 million for an attack by the NetWalker gang. However, I'm going to defend them slightly because that was at the start of the pandemic, and they are a medical establishment. So we don't know what pressure that put them under as a medical establishment. So I give them some sort of leeway there. What was interesting, I would go and look at that particular incident, though. If you want to see the conversation between the victim and the cyber attacker, they published all the logs of chat and etc. So you can actually see the negotiation go backwards and forwards. Very interesting to go back and read. And what does ransomware mean today? Well, it's data encryption. So there's and this theft of data, extraction of data to the dark web, which means it's a double extortion mechanism, because if you recover from the data encryption, then they'll publish the data. So they've got this double hold over you. Yeah, they may use other tactics, print bombing, cold calling, denial of service, and other such tactics to put the pressure on a company, or use one of those tactics alongside the encryption, or it may be a mix of all these different things together. So it's an issue. It's an issue. It potentially brings the company to its knees. Now, if we look at ransomware attacks in 2021, we can see the dominant places where ransomware attacks are happening. This is ESET's research telemetry. And as you can see, it's very significant. I looked up some other stats specifically for the Indian market, actually, when I put this presentation together, and about 3 out of 4, so 75% of businesses in India say that they've had an incident of ransomware. So we know this is a prevalent attack. I don't think, if you're listening to this presentation, I don't need to sell this piece to you. But where did they get so big? Well, if we then look at cyber attacks, and this is a very more of a US focused slide, because that's where I'm based and that's kind of the news I read. If we look at what happened over 2021, Colonial Pipeline at $4.4 million they paid. Garmin reportedly paid around $10 million. Then you had JBS Foods for $14 million. A big one in here that seemed to slip under the radar of a lot of people was $40 million for a company called CNA Financial. Now, the significance of this is it's going up in price. And this is because you've got cyber insurers involved, and we may come back to that slightly. But you've also got your companies willing to pay to get out of this quickly, because they're infrastructure type companies. So Colonial Pipeline is infrastructure. JBS, being a food supplier, is seen as, and they're a global food supplier that took down their operations all over the world. They're a food supplier too. And then you got 2 that didn't pay. Kaseya, so that was a supply chain ransomware attack where it affected about 1,700 businesses globally. And then we've got MediaMarkt, who the demand was $240 million. Again, these 2 didn't pay it. So I'm just making that point. I'm just showing that where this is going and how quickly this is going in this direction. And then, because of Colonial Pipeline, now important to say that the executive order that you saw the US enact about cybersecurity, so you've got these big attacks, have pushed politicians to actually put out executive orders or legislation on certain industry sectors and on government institutions to actually fix their cybersecurity lack of investment over years and the state of their cybersecurity. Now, if you look at what this executive order states, I mean, and I like this because it kind of gives us that core list of accelerate digital transformation, put encryption in, put multi-factor authentication in. So it's forcing those companies in those sectors to actually review what they're doing and bring it up to a level of security that we'd expect. Now, the problem is it shouldn't have taken an attack on infrastructure, i.e. voters, so the citizens of a country having to line up to get gas, to have pushed this type of regulation on industry sectors. So that's an interesting play on it, and I think more governments will go down this path. And that's my point here: is this is not just a US and executive order. I think all governments will be looking at this, going, we need to do the same thing in our countries, and I'm sure no country is outside of that. Now, I put this one in here. I always call out Blackball because, by the way, if you do defeat ransomware, it doesn't mean you're home and dry. Blackball is a company that defeated the cyber criminals, but unfortunately they ended up paying not to publish the data. So I always turn and say, don't think if you've got the best, it's not, it's this double extortion issue is a big issue. So moving quickly on, is it legal or ethical to pay? Well, that's really geographically dependent, but general rule here is it's not illegal to pay the ransom. However, there are a UN sanctions list, and I list here the sanctions list of the US Department of Treasury. It's fairly mimicky of some of the other sanctions lists you see around the world. If you pay somebody on a sanctions list, then it becomes quickly illegal. However, we haven't seen anybody actually prosecuted for paying a ransomware demand, to my knowledge, that's of something on the sanctions list. However, if you get hit, and just say you're an Indian company doing business with a US company, and you fall foul of paying a ransomware demand to a crypto wallet that's on the Office of Foreign Asset Control sanctions list, then potentially you could end up being on the sanctions list yourself, because you're funding somebody else on the sanctions list. And not only you, but the cryptocurrency exchange you've used. If you're using a cyber risk insurer, then they could end up on it, because they may have in some way funded it. Your bank that facilitated the payment to the cryptocurrency exchange, they could all end up falling foul. So this is becoming slightly harder. Now, up until around, I would say, the middle of last year to 9 months of 2021, you saw very few cyber-related things on this sanctions list, or very few that were broad. However, in November, this sanctions list grew, and it grew beyond individuals. It grew to cryptocurrency wallets, because these wallets have been identified as being associated with ransomware payments. So the importance here is that you need to go and check and do your homework. So if you are going to pay a ransomware demand, or are thinking about this, you need to go and do a lot of research legally, whether you're doing something that's not going to get you into a lot of trouble. Now, my own view here is you should never pay, by the way. And the role of cyber risk insurance here, I think that's super interesting, because two-factor authentication, encryption, EDR, all becoming part of that policy. And in the US, with those big demands, they're seeing some of these policies increase by 470% in premiums. So this is maybe not the answer either. You've also seen legislation come through in Australia. There's a ransomware payments bill. In the US, a Ransomware Disclosure Act. And you're also seeing regulators. So, for example, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation are enacting these requirements for companies to come forward and state they've either got an incident. In this case, the FDIC is stating while an incident, within a certain frame of knowing the incident happens. But the other two bills, Australia and in the US, those acts are about notifying after you've paid a ransomware demand. So, this is a bit like being, going home, catching the burglar in the house, but waiting for the burglar to run off down the street with all your stuff, and then calling law enforcement to come round and saying you had the burglar. You'd call while the burglar was in the house. So I expect this will all move on. I expect that by the end of the year, a country somewhere will have turned around and said, you've got to notify the law enforcement authorities when you know about a ransomware attack, not after you've paid the ransomware. Now, that's an interesting scenario, because what happens if other countries fail to regulate or legislate in the same way? Will this map then look different? So, for example, if we take this map and let's use India as the example here. If you legislated that ransomware, it was illegal to pay a ransomware demand, then your country here goes yellow. But that means the cyber criminal business, and this is where the front of my presentation kind of links with the back, is the people that were making money from that cybercrime business aren't going to stop. They will then go and target the countries where they can be paid. So you don't want to be the last country to actually restrict, limit, or enforce non-payment in some way, or limit it so that it's very complex for a company to pay, because you could end up becoming the primary target or the easy target for cyber criminals to campaign against. And cryptocurrency plays a large part in this. And we often hear in Hollywood movies, don't we, that follow the money and stop the money, because that is a significant portion of these people are making significant amounts of money. And we're seeing, of course, eco warriors on this cryptocurrency one as well, of saying cryptocurrency is bad for the environment, but it's also bad for cybercrime. So realistically, if somebody legislated or regulated cryptocurrency, this would be on the side of cybersecurity professionals. Us as defenders of technology and the digital environment would benefit from regulation in cryptocurrency. Now, you might not all see that right from the outset, but certain countries, 42 countries have banned some form of crypto exchanges and such like because of the funneling of funds into illegal sources. You've got, I think there's 8 to 12 countries that have banned it altogether. We've seen China ban it, Egypt, Iraq, Qatar, Oman, Morocco. There's a long list of countries that are banning some of these things. So again, if that starts restricting it, if you're in a country where this regulation isn't happening or legislation isn't happening, you could end up, unfortunately, having an incident there of being the primary target. So it requires further regulation. So legislation empowers cyber defenders without question. In privacy legislation, it empowered cyber defenders because it gave them the reason to go into the boardroom and ask for budget because the companies had to do something. And I'm sure you're going to witness that more with your legislation that's going through currently. And I think legislation around security incidents, malware incidents, and payments of ransomware is also going to empower cyber defenders. It's going to allow you to have the budget and the freedom to go and do what you need to do to protect the business. It's going to justify it. And I'm going to leave you with this is give in to the cyber criminal, pay the cyber criminal, you're going to breed more cybercrime. I think that goes without too much saying. I am from ESET. Yeah, do please reach out to us. If you've got questions around cybersecurity, we are a research-focused company with products, as opposed to being a product company with research. We're the other way around, but it's super important. Come and talk to us. We can help you. We do the multi-factor authentication. We do endpoint security. We do EDR, and we do encryption as well. So do please come and have a discussion with us. We'd be more than happy to answer your questions. And thank you for listening to my presentation today.